When the line of forts on Portsdown Hill, commonly known as Palmerston's Follies, were constructed in the 1850s, it was recognised that the eastern end of the line was relatively undefended. This would be particularly dangerous if the French, the assumed invaders, should choose to land a little to the east along the beaches of West Sussex, or perhaps into the harbours of Emsworth, Chichester or Bosham. Then protection to the eastern front was essential to buy time. A year or so ago I approached a member of the Palmerston Fort Society, a very knowledgeable chap on the subject, to come and speak to us about the deep defences for Fort Pembroke. Regrettably, he felt unable to comply, and indeed he no longer feels well enough to give talks at all, so I decided I had better research the subject myself. This leads me to this talk, which is on the subject of the three outworks to Fort Pembroke, namely Farlington, Crookhorn and the so-called Langstone Redoubts. Just to get our definitions correct, a redoubt is defined as a temporary or supplementary fortification, typically square or polygonal in outline and without flanking defences. The great ring of Victorian fortifications to defend Portsmouth from attack by an invading force, landing to west and later perhaps to the east, was started with the construction beginning in 1852 with the Gosport Line. Fort Gomer, now demolished, was completed in 1858, and Fort Elson, in a very sorry state of repair and unfortunately inaccessible since it still lies on Ministry of Defence owned land, in 1860. Following this, the Royal Commission reported in the same year proposing a ring of fortifications around a number of key naval harbours: Plymouth, Chatham, Pembroke and Milford Haven, Portland, Falmouth, the Thames Estuary, Dover, Cork, and most significant of all, the key naval dockyard at Portsmouth. Not all were built, but the Defence Act of 1860 allocated a huge sum of money, and plans for a series of forts along the ridge were drawn up. As you can see from this map, which shows all the fortifications which were actually built, the main idea was to ring Fortress Portsmouth with several lines of fortifications to protect the dockyard and the fleet housed within it and out into the Solent from attack from any invading force. What is also clear from this map is that the fortifications to the west were considerably deeper and more extensive than those in our direction, and for this reason 3 additional smaller redoubts were planned and 2 built to support the eastern end of the ridge. All 3 were outworks of the most easterly of the Portsdown Hill forts, Fort Pembroke. Pembroke, like the other 4 big forts along the top of the hill, as you can see, is a polygonal fortification designed to shoot across a curve to the north, from northwest to northeast, to protect the naval defenders to the south from attack from the lee side of the Portsdown escarpment. This is why, because the guns seem to point in the wrong direction, people have frequently known the hilltop forts as Palmerston's Follies. This antique map, unfortunately wildly inaccurate, does clearly show how the land falls sharply from the heights where Fort Pembroke was built into a potentially dangerous open area, and it is this danger that the 3 redoubts were planned to overcome. Here on a modern satellite image you can see the position of Fort Pembroke to the west, Crookhorn, Farlington and Langstone redoubts in their positions as they lie today. Crookhorn Redoubt was the first to be attempted, with work starting in 1862. It lay to the northeast of Fort Pembroke, and the site can be visited as it lies within the golf course. The path that used to run from Underdown Road into the golf course passed across the site of the outwork, but this seems to have been blocked just recently. As planned, the redoubt was specifically designed to cover an area of dead ground commanding the northeast approaches up Portsdown Ridge, but which could not be adequately covered by the original design of Fort Pembroke. The front face of the redoubt was to have been at an acute angle, to have had two caponniers, from the French for chicken coop, a defensive box for guns to poke out and fire from, counterscarp and scarp galleries for musket and rifle fire, and originally it was planned to have 16 guns on a terraplane, a high protected firing platform, and 6 guns in the corner caponniers. Unfortunately, a section of blue slipper clay, as opposed to the chalk of the rest of the escarpment, was discovered, and only the southern half of the original design was pursued. This proved inadequate, and by 1870, when only the prepared earthworks with no brickwork yet built on, it had been abandoned. With its own magazines and barracks, Crookhorn Redoubt could possibly have stood as a small outstation alone from the fort. There are indications that a tunnel or covered way ran from the northeasterly caponnier of Fort Pembroke towards this site, and the start of this can still be seen on the ground. This can be found towards Farlington Redoubt and turns sharply eastwards. By 1874 only a single outwork was reported to Fort Pembroke, and 2 years later, in 1876, Crookhorn was claimed to have been demolished, although the shape of it is still visible in the ground today. This diagram shows the point A from whence the tunnel probably originated to direct out to Crookhorn Redoubt. Unlike Crookhorn Redoubt, Farlington Redoubt, on the other hand, most definitely was constructed, although not fully as designed. Work started late in 1862 and was completed by 1891. In the original plan, there were to have been a complement of 18 guns plus 2 batteries of 3 mortars mounted behind the eastern caponnier. This model duplicated the structures at the northern extremities of the larger forts on the ridge, but was abandoned probably because of cost overruns, and the final outfit of munitions is as shown in the constructed design of 1896, shown here. Though the magazine was subterranean, most of the construction was on a single level with walls built up on the 5 outlying sides. 2 64-pounder rifle muzzle-loaded guns were mounted on the clever Moncrief disappearing mounts, which effectively removed the guns from sight of the enemy while they were reloaded, while a further series of guns mounted on more flexible gun carriages were installed in the parapet. Originally, in 1876, it had been proposed that 14 such guns would be kept within Fort Pembroke for deployment along the covered way in time of need. By 1898, this had been reduced to just 7, but kept permanently at the redoubt itself. These were augmented by a single 4-inch breech loader situated at the southeastern corner to cover the gap southward that the 2 caponniers could not adequately fire towards. The redoubt was probably not especially effective. None of the Portsdown Ridge forts ever fired a shot in anger, and by 1907 Farlington Redoubt had been disarmed. However, it was reused during both World Wars, fitted as a machine gun outpost in 1914, and it was suggested as an anti-aircraft battery during the Second World War, although the 3 chosen sites for these were actually on the other side of the slope, facing north, to take out both incoming and returning aircraft from various raids over southern England. Shortly before the outbreak of World War II, once this decision had been made, the War Office decided to dispose of the redoubt, and it was put on the market. Seeing the convenience of the position and the huge potential supply of chalk that would arise by cutting away the central dumpling standing proud above the dry moat, and with a view to the causeway construction of the eastern road into Portsmouth, Fraser and White purchased the site. They also acquired a narrow strip of land from the War Office such that a new access point from Portsdown Hill Road could be constructed, the original access having been from the west and indicated by the covered way on this picture. The site of Farlington Redoubt was hence converted into a quarry after 1945, and later the whole area was demolished in the 1970s to make way for an underground storage facility for British Gas. The site is currently the headquarters for L&S Waste Management Limited, who park their extensive skip lorries on the remains of the outwork, whose outline shape is clearly visible in aerial photographs of the site. Also clearly visible is the remains of the covered way leading towards Fort Pembroke, which originally was, I think, planned to enter through the south-eastern musketry gallery, although quite speedily it seems to have been rerouted to join with the more complex covered way to Crookhorn Redoubt to the north. Langstone Redoubt. This was never built nor indeed named, but a section of the site between the railway line and the motorway now contains the remnants of a World War I and invasion redoubt. This is extremely difficult to access, requiring more than 1 mile walk from the Farlington Marshes car park, and the remains are not particularly impressive, although it probably would have been useful for anti-invasion had that occurred. With regard to the planned 19th century redoubt, it was to have been four-sided, and uniquely for the Portsmouth fortifications, but like the Gosport line, this was to have had a wet ditch or moat on all sides. The design is similar to that used for Fort Gilkicker on the southern side of Stokes Bay, and it was originally intended to mount 18 guns. Although never constructed, the plans can be seen. The 1868 investigation were told that an earthwork would be constructed, and there is some evidence for this, although much of it has disappeared under the motorway. There is no doubt that this was a well-chosen site to defend Langstone Harbour and the railway, hence the reason for its reuse in World War I. I'm extremely grateful to a number of contributors and experts in my investigations, and would especially like to mention David Moore, editor of Redan monthly house magazine of the Palmerston Fort Society, Gary Mitchell's Solent Paper No. 3 and his public domain data sheets for all of the forts and redoubts, Peter Crabb of the UK Fortifications Club, and Bob Hurt's brilliant portsdowntunnels.org.uk website.